What if I told you the Imperium of Man is losing, not just to aliens or traitors, but to itself? That its greatest threat isn't the tyrannids or chaos, but the way it governs, fights, thinks, even how it builds its cities. This video breaks down the empire of a million worlds in the same way that modern military analysts break down failed states. When I went through it, the Imperium wasn't just grimdark, it was often oddly familiar. Before we dive into the video proper though, I want to talk a little bit about the framework that I'm going to use to break it all down. It's called PMESII-PT, or PMESII, I think. It was originally developed and used by military powers, especially in the US. I've no military training myself, and I've never used this sort of planning before, so if I make any mistakes about how it's supposed to be used, please let me know. But I think this makes for an excellent framework to map out an entire society. There are 9 different aspects of society that this system measures: political, military, economic, social, information, infrastructure, physical environment, and time. It's a little clunky and clinical. I'm sure there's plenty of justifiable criticism of the system itself, but I think it works surprisingly well for thinking about how the Imperium of Man actually functions and where it doesn't. As always, I've tried to use real-world examples and examples taken directly from many different sources in the lore of Warhammer 40k. So, with all that said, let's start with the first pillar, the most popular topic to double up with any Warhammer lore video: politics. Political power in the Imperium of Man is a strange thing. The central government can't even command the Space Marines, arguably their most powerful force. But it can exert enormous pressure on people who actually govern Imperial worlds, the planetary governors. These are some of the most ridiculed characters in the 40k setting. The idea of a corrupt and incompetent Imperial governor keeps coming up on planets all across the Milky Way galaxy. This is a feature of Imperial policy, not just something that Games Workshop and their writers use to come up with foils for the main heroes of whatever story we're engaging with. I would argue that the prevalence of incompetent governors is a reaction to the general political policies of the central Imperial government. The High Lords of Terra and the Imperial government as a whole only really want a few things from their local planetary or sectoral governors. They want the number of psychers and mutants under control, and most importantly, they want the Imperial tithe, or tax, to be met in full. The Imperium doesn't really care what means are used in order for this to happen, provided that it does. If the local government is a democracy like we would be familiar with, great. If the local government is run by a tyrannical authoritarian, great. If it's a theocratic cult that makes people whip themselves constantly throughout the day, great. Provided Terra gets its due, they don't really mind what else goes on. This often leads to some unsavory people gaining and maintaining power in the Imperium. For example, in the video game Dawn of War 2, we can briefly hear about the Imperial governor of the planet Meridian in the Aurelian sector, Gregor Vandis. He ignored the needs of his world during the initial stages of the Tyranid invasion of the sector. Instead of providing the aid the Space Marines needed directly, he requested their help in stopping Eldar raids on the estates of the world's nobles. We can't be sure of his exact intentions. Was he willfully unaware of the threat posed by the Tyranids, or was he simply stalling for time to gather as much personal wealth as he could before he could escape off-world? Either way, his rule was encouraged by the Imperium. Because he was able to keep the tithe paid and the levels of mutation down, incompetence in any other area didn't really matter, until it did. Having said that, even when we encounter a supposedly competent governor, there are still plenty of issues that keep arising. In the Dark Heresy RPG, the governor of the Calixus sector is Marius Hex. He is described as a competent ruler who was bred for leadership and is from ancient Terran stock. He is driven by the necessity for order and the survival of the human race. He rules with Terra's goals first in his mind. Hax seems to have governed the area of space relatively competently, all things considered, for over a century. His intentions aren't nearly as self-serving as many of the other governors that we encounter. In stories, he has even managed to maintain the Imperium's control over a vast area of space. He's not obviously corrupt, and in many ways in the Imperium, that can actually be worse. There are millions of people that live and die by his word, and he refuses to acknowledge and really care about them. The survival of humanity in the form of the Imperium is all that really matters. If millions of people suffer and die to maintain the production quotas for the Imperial tithe, that's a price he is willing to pay. He will do anything for the collective survival of humanity, provided that it fits the ideology that he aligns with. He is set up to be a character that is constantly dealing with insurrections and rebellions. He probably spends more time putting down uprisings than dealing with any Xenos threat. And why wouldn't he? The policies that he used on his own people all but guarantee revolt and then punish people for revolting. In the real world, there are plenty of examples of this kind of thing happening again and again and again. Local governments in various countries around the world have been toppled by stronger powers in order to keep money and resources flowing in the right direction. Let's talk about a few real-world comparisons where governments did exactly this. Now, please make sure to like and subscribe. So, in an Irish context, the obvious comparison is to the Great Hunger of 1845 to 52. People sometimes call this event the Irish Potato Famine. Irish tenant farmers were forced to pay rents on tiny plots of land, sometimes working on large estates to earn rent or sometimes growing small amounts of cash crops like wheat. Because of the huge wealth disparity at the time, with only about 5,000 individuals owning about 90% of the land, these tenant farmers were forced to live on a diet which consisted of sometimes as much as 80% potatoes. When a blight killed the crop off in the whole of Europe in 1845, other governments were able to supplement their citizens' diets. In Ireland, however, the population was still forced to pay expensive rents to their local landlord. With the crop of potatoes gone, cash crops were eaten and the rent stopped getting received by many landlords. This led to mass evictions throughout the country. Then, when people tried to do things like fish or hunt, this was often seen as a criminal act, and the punishment was exile to penal colonies in Australia. Any sufficient change made to this economic system would have been seen by the government at the time as going against God's will. The invisible hand of the free market was, of course, the hand of God, according to the contemporary Vice-Chancellor of the Exchequer, Lord Trevelyan. Any impediment to the export of food, like beef, was met with a harsh reaction from the British military. Not only has the population of Ireland not recovered from its pre-1845 level, but also this event is considered one of the key motivators behind the subsequently successful push for Irish independence a couple of generations later. Even more recently, and with a lot more relevance for the current geopolitical world climate, is the example of the 1953 Iranian coup. That year, the democratically elected Prime Minister of Iran, Mohammad Mossadegh, I'm going to butcher the pronunciations for this, guys, I'm very, very sorry. He was overthrown and replaced by the more autocratic Shah Mohammad Reza Pahlavi. Mossadegh's government was attempting to audit the documents of the Anglo-Iranian Oil Company, now part of BP, and limit that company's control of Iran's oil reserves. This coup led to the first use of the term blowback, which was coined by an internal CIA history of the event. The ascent of the authoritarian Shah led to many of the more progressive and pro-democracy elements of Iranian society to decline. It's also pretty widely accepted that this coup was one of the main contributing factors for the 1979 Iranian Revolution. That established the even more authoritarian, religious, and anti-Western Islamic Republic. I think the Imperium of Man offers us a great critique of something that keeps coming up in world politics. Strong, centralized authorities causing a huge amount of suffering in a specific area for their own short-term gain. Then, they discover that these actions have actually created more problems for themselves in the long run. More problems than they ever had before. People usually aren't blind to when they're being exploited. They will usually have a pretty justifiable grudge against whoever is doing the exploiting. Imperial governors like Marius Hex have to spend far more of their time dealing with rebels and seditionists than they'd like. The Imperial Guard spends most of its time fighting against secessionists around the galaxy, rather than the greater threats that the Imperium has to deal with. The Imperium spends most of its military resources dealing with blowback from its own exploitative policies on its worlds. Then, it needs to fund and fuel this war effort, which leads to more extraction. This further extraction leads to more exploitation, and look, you can see where I'm going with all this. So what can we do to improve the politics of the Imperium? This might be one of the most grimdark things that I'll ever talk about on this channel, but based on the real world, I don't know if you really can improve this. Whatever about how necessary the Imperium is for the survival of humanity, its very nature is based around conquering the galaxy. There are few ways to do something like that without causing suffering or exploitation. But as I'll talk about throughout this video, maybe the Imperium could be better about its planning and centralization when it comes to other aspects of how it operates. Maybe, by improving things like its local economies and societies, it can improve its overall political structures. It might just have to do a few of these things at the same time. Just like in the real world, ruling for extraction and through fear can only really work to a point. Eventually, people will stop being afraid and start getting tired of feeling like their lives are being ruled for the benefit of someone else. As for how to improve these things in the real world, I don't know. Maybe just don't invade other countries. Now, I will wait patiently for my Nobel Peace Prize on that, and of course the compulsory death threats in the comments too. Okay, so for this next section, I'm going to make another bold statement. Its military is the thing the Imperium probably does the best. Controversial statement, I know. From the vast and inexhaustible regiments of the Imperial Guard to the elite Custodes of Terra, there are so many weapons at the disposal of the Imperial war machine that it can be hard to comprehend the sheer scale of them. In fact, there seems to be entire YouTube channels devoted to describing all of the myriad of these forces in minute and exhaustive detail. But that's also one of the biggest weaknesses of the Imperial military, just how vast and unimaginable it is. When the Imperium loses wars, it's not because it lacks any strength, it's because it can't point that strength in the right direction fast enough. While it's more than capable of dealing with any of the threats that come its way, it struggles to deal with all of them at the same time. Sustaining any logistics over a large area is always a challenge, and this is only compounded on a galactic scale. The Imperium is often described as being stretched thin across 1,000,000 worlds. Yes, its armies are essentially limitless, but moving them from one war zone to another is where the Imperial Central Command really struggles. With so many military assets scattered across the galaxy, the Imperium rarely knows what it has, let alone where it is or how fast it can be deployed. There are just too many threats both within and without Imperial space to be able to keep track of them reliably. The greatest champion the Imperium has to combat this challenge is definitely the Primarch Roboute Guilliman of the Ultramarines chapter. I and plenty of others have already spoken at length about him and his supreme command of logistics, but it's still worth mentioning again briefly. In his Indomitus crusade to reclaim parts of the galaxy lost in the aftermath of the opening of the Great Rift, his skill has really shone. During the Plague Wars in Ultramar, he was able to defeat the armies of Nurgle and the corrupted Primarch Mortarion, through the use of combined arms and, of course, a little help from his daddy. He organised the strength of the disparate branches of the Imperial military, and he used them to support one another across a multi-front campaign. Without going into too many spoilers for the Dark Imperium series by Guy Haley, this logistical skill was one of the key elements of the Imperial victory against the forces of chaos. Yet Guilliman is one of the few people in the whole of the setting who is seemingly capable of organising the different resources of the Imperium in the right way. Even the other returned loyalist Primarch, the Lion, seems to struggle when it comes to logistical organisation. While still an excellent and talented leader, he does seem to struggle with managing the overwhelming amount of resources needed to bring the full might of the Imperial armies to bear. Historically, the most successful empires weren't just good at fighting, they were good at organising. The Romans had the roads and the British ruled the waves. These groups were better able to mobilise their forces. More than that though, the countries that were better able to simply organise themselves both knew what they had to deal with and what they had at hand. The commonly used example of this sort of thing working in practice is definitely the Second World War. One of the more interesting and sometimes overlooked ways of looking at that conflict is through the lens of logistics. The Axis powers were cut off from the wider world and vital war resources like oil. The Allied nations eventually had virtual control of the world's oceans and were much better able to supply each other's forces with all the bare necessities. The logistical superiority of the Allied nations is really what won them the war. There were three main successes, after which victory was all but assured, even though it would still cost countless lives and cause untold more hardship and struggle. The Soviet Union moved its military production east of the Ural mountain range. This was out of range of German aircraft. They were never really able to create a reliable long-range bomber during the war. The British, supported by the US, were eventually able to overcome the U-boat menace in the Atlantic Ocean through a combined effort of commando attacks on U-boat facilities and improvements in naval tactics. The US government also decided to kick what was left of the Great Depression out by creating a state-led manufacturing sector that was able to outproduce the rest of the world for a couple of decades to come. They were famously so effective at creating war machines that their Pacific fleet was even able to have the luxury of a few vessels solely dedicated to making ice cream for their forces. While the story of the Japanese admiral learning about them and declaring the war was lost is probably not true, the fact remains that these ships were real and show how effective the US was at logistics and how much better they were than their opponents. During the Second World War, the Allies were able to plan out their military capacity in a way that was forward-thinking and sustainable, while at the same time, they remained flexible enough to deal with multiple different threats on multiple different fronts. The Imperium seems largely incapable of this sort of thinking. It doesn't spread its economic or military capacity out in anything resembling a sustainable way. It creates forge worlds, fortress worlds, and armory worlds like Vrax. I'm not going to delve too much into the lore behind the siege here, but the Imperium used Vrax as an armory world for equipment. This was then exploited by the enemies of mankind and used against the armies of the Imperium. One of the great ironies in the lore is that it was actually Guilliman who created this organizational silo structure that the Imperium uses despite its best interests. In the aftermath of the Horus Heresy, he created the Codex Astartes. He not only split up the Space Marine legions, but he also split up the other armed forces of the Imperium, like the old Imperial Army from any spaceborne assets. This created both the Imperial Guard and the Imperial Navy. While there was a definite need to do this in the aftermath of a tragedy as bad as the Heresy, it definitely did mean that the Imperial military assets would be disorganized for millennia to come, to at least some extent. Guilliman's new approach, one taking full advantage of the might of combined arms, might not just win more wars, it might stop some from needing to be fought in the first place. Logistics isn't just about moving troops around, it's about knowing what you have, where you need it, and when it's too late. But how easily is something like that done in a setting like Warhammer 40k? Guilliman can't possibly be everywhere, and there is so much inertia already built into the system doing the same thing it has done for thousands of years. So, I've already spoken about the money used in the Imperium in another video, linked in the description. I'm not going to go into that too much here, but there are a few key points I will repeat. To start, there isn't really a single universal currency used throughout the entirety of Imperial space that can be accessed by all of its citizens. The very nature of the Imperium and how vast it is just kind of makes that an impossibility. There are more commonly used money systems, like Throne's Geld, but there are also some more niche examples, like bullets being used as currency in some Imperial hives. The thing that links all of these many varied and disparate forms of currency together is what their value is usually based around. Most Imperial planetary money systems base their value around the local world's tithe. The debt that the planet has to pay to the wider Imperium is what the value of the local currency is usually based on. In short, the economy is built to serve the tithe, not the people, and that makes it catastrophically fragile. For some worlds, their tithe is measured in the creation of regiments for the Imperial Guard. For others, their tithe is measured in raw materials that are stripped away. Other worlds have been designated as agri-worlds whose sole purpose is to grow food to feed other places. This often creates massive inequalities and discrepancies between different worlds, even those that might be governed by the same local jurisdiction. It also makes the Imperium and its constituent planets more vulnerable. In this setting, faster-than-light travel is reliably unreliable. This is one of the more common tropes that we can see across all the various 40k media. Armies will struggle to get reinforcements in time, and characters may have to spend months or years waiting for favourable warp conditions before they can travel from one part of space to another. The most extreme example of this is Holy Terra itself, the home world of humanity. Long since having been turned into an ecumenopolis, it functionally cannot grow any food to feed its population, which is enormous, at the very least 200 billion, if not much, much, much higher. When the Great Rift opened up, they were no longer able to receive any food shipments from off-world. This led to mass famine, and countless Imperial citizens of the capital world starved. In reality, the global economy seems to have shifted closer and closer to what we see in the Imperium. Pretty much every nation on Earth is part of a much wider and interconnected system of trade and global capital. If anyone has ever seen the movie Network from the 1970s, there is a great scene which describes the burgeoning system of global trade. It always comes to my mind when I think about this sort of thing. But whether we like this system or not, everyone relies on people from the other side of the planet who we will likely never meet. With the way things work today, most people will actually have to go out of their way to find food or products created locally. One of the main methods of shipping used by modern businesses is called just-in-time shipping. It was developed by car manufacturers in Japan who would save money on storage costs by only ensuring that they had exactly the goods they needed at the exact right time. This system saved so much money that it has seemingly been used in nearly every single industry since. While there are absolutely definitely benefits to this in terms of savings for consumers, there are issues with it too. I'm sure many of you can remember when in March 2021, the Suez Canal was blocked by the container ship the Ever Given. One of the most important international shipping routes in the world was blocked for nearly a week, and it had ripple effects that were felt throughout the global economy. I'm sure other lore tubers have spoken about this event as well, but it is worth repeating again for this. According to one estimate, the total cost of this obstruction of the Suez Canal amounted to nearly $80 billion, or 0.1% of the total GDP of the planet. There's always going to be a need for international trade. There are plenty of regions that need it in order to survive. But this event is one of the more obvious examples of just how unsustainable our global economy can be. Some regions genuinely depend on global trade to survive, yes, absolutely, but many more could produce vital goods locally if they weren't locked into this exploitative system. If a 6-day blockage of one canal can shake the global economy, imagine relying on warp routes that could vanish for generations. In the Imperium, of course, all of this is dialed up way past 11. There are entire planets that cannot sustain their populations with enough food, water, or air to live. Yet those planets are vital industrial hubs for other regions that need manufactured goods. There's no reason why the Imperium cannot have a more planned out economy where vital goods like food and more basic manufacturing can be done at a more sustainable and more local level. Indeed, with the whole lack of any reliable interstellar travel, this is actually a must. Of course, we have to consider that there are certain goods that can only be created in certain places. There are planets that genuinely have better access to resources. One world might have a particular vital mineral that is needed for the construction of war machines. There might also be a certain forge world that has access to irreplaceable machinery, and that could be used to create things like advanced warships or titans. So there will obviously be a need, always be a need, for some interstellar trade. It just shouldn't come at the cost of potentially devastating imperial worlds if there's any interruption. But at the end of the day, if the Imperium were ever to do something like this, i.e. make an economy that actually makes sense, then we wouldn't be able to have games of miniatures fighting on a planet-sized farm or factory. A battle on a continent-sized munitions depot might be worth a completely unsustainable and violently fragile economy. And at the end of the day, isn't that what's really important? When it comes to imperial society, in many ways it's actually more brittle than the economy. Their social structure isn't designed to work, it's designed to survive, which in the Imperium means not just an unequal class system, but a rigid hierarchy, enforced with zealous fervour. For the unnumbered masses of humanity in the Imperium of Man, there is precious little in the way of social mobility. You are usually born into the role that you will have for the rest of your life. There will be almost nothing that you can do to escape crushing poverty. Let's be honest about this here. Being a citizen of the Imperium is not great. If you could choose to live in any fictional setting, this one really shouldn't be on your list at all. Demons exist. There are also aliens that will try to come from outside the galaxy and kill you. But what makes a lot of these threats worse, and some of them even possible to begin with, is how miserable life is for the average subject of the Emperor of Mankind. There are plenty of different types of planets in the galaxy that play host to human life, each one with their own unique conditions and historical circumstances, but at least a plurality of imperial citizens live in hive cities. These are often mountain-sized settlements that have their own atmosphere separate to the rest of the planet they reside on. Billions of people will live, work and die in the same building with countless others. I think the fact that these settlements are called hives is something that people don't talk about enough. In Warhammer 40k, people don't live like cattle, or even rats. They live like insects. As the good old 40k quote that we all know and love goes, to be a man in such times is to be one among untold billions. For most people, they will be born into a community that will work in the one specific factory or farm or whatever, and their descendants will work in the same role as them for as long as the world they live on remains the same, which in the Imperium can often be an unfortunately long time. But even through all this grim darkness, there is still a slight hope of advancement. Some of the most prestigious groups in the Imperium of Man will often recruit from among the lowliest communities. The Space Marines are a great example of this. They will often use some of the harshest environments in the galaxy as recruiting worlds. So, if you are a member of a primitive tribe on a death world or a gang member living in the Underhive, there might be a Space Marine recruitment drive in your lifetime. Usually, these things happen once per generation for many of these communities. The local chapter will descend from the heavens and leave with a select few of the best examples of that generation's youth. They will also leave behind many more dead, wounded, and permanently crippled members of that generation's youth. But at least a few will make it out. For regular humans, there's also the possibility of joining the Imperial Guard or Navy as an escape from this crushing hardship. If there's a recruitment drive for the Guard, plenty of people from a planet will decide to join in order to escape the confines of their homeworld. While they might not necessarily have a better life in the stars, or even be alive for much longer, they will at least get to live. For many, This is genuinely a better option than staying in the manufactorum that their ancestors worked in. One of the more reliable ways of advancements in the Imperium is to have your parents die in service to the Emperor. That way, you might just be inducted into the Schola Progenium. Again, I think I'm pronouncing that correctly, I don't know. This is the main education system for the Imperial elite. While we don't really get to see it described in much detail, we do know that many of the unaugmented human characters in the setting received their education from at least one Schola. There are plenty of orphan characters like Commissar Yarrick that will go from losing all of their loved ones to becoming great Imperial heroes. This organization is also usually the starting point for the careers of plenty of Imperial inquisitors and leaders, both civilian and military. The Schola are run by the Ecclesiarchy, not the Excelsiarchy, okay? I'm learning. I'm trying to improve my pronunciation, alright? I'm doing my best. The facilities that the Schola run are often built like fortresses, not just for the protection of the students, or the progenia as they're called, but also to stop them from escaping. They're orphans forced into a rigid and horrifically harsh training environment. This environment will be designed to be as harsh as possible to better test the physical and mental fortitude of the future Imperial leadership. Upon graduating the Schola, people who would have otherwise been the common dregs of Imperial society will often become some of its most important leaders. Their children will then go on to be born into a higher caste of society. There are even some adults who will be able to access this social mobility. If an individual, like a guardsman, has shown exceptional loyalty to the Emperor through their actions, they will be given a chance to attend the Schola too. But they will have to start from the same level as any of the children they will study alongside. This sort of thing does go on in reality. As much as we might not like to think it, there is still plenty of class divisions in many parts of the world, a lot of which are based around education. The harsh and brutal nature of the Schola Progenium is really reminiscent, at least in my mind, of the stories I've heard about the harsh nature of the British public school system. Full disclosure here, I have thankfully very little understanding of the British education system, so I can only go by what I've read or heard about, either from historical sources, Harry Potter, or friends of mine who've had to suffer through it. For some reason, they use the name public schools for a certain type of extremely exclusive private school that has, at least in the past, been associated with boarding. These are places that were designed to create the leadership of the British Empire in generations gone by. As such, while they did offer an excellent education, they were often considered brutal places to grow up. There are plenty of stories going back centuries in real life of students having to endure horrific abuse, physically, emotionally, and otherwise. This systemic abuse came from the faculty and from the student population. It created a leadership caste that viewed the world as a much more brutal place than it really was, and that it was their duty to put order to it. One literary example that came from this culture was the famous novel Lord of the Flies by William Golding. A group of young boys are stranded on an isolated island for an extended period of time, and they delve into violence and abuse. Separated from the more civilized world made these children devolve into becoming almost feral. On the other hand, when this actually happened to a group of boys from Tonga in the 1960s, they actually seemed to have worked together. They divided labour and helped share their limited resources for 15 whole months until their eventual rescue. When it comes to education, like in the Imperium, in the real world, it is often the best indicator of wealth and social class. We might not have any hive cities yet, but an elite education often replicates the same function as this class system. It seals people off from opportunity and produces rulers from birth. Probably the most famous school in the world is Harvard in the United States. While theoretically open to all and affording opportunity to explore and expand the fields of human knowledge to everyone around the world, the numbers tell a different story. At least 40% of the graduates from arguably the most prestigious university on earth go on to work in either finance or consulting. They will wind up managing the wealth and work of many of the top businesses, industries, and economies throughout the world. Even though they might not have a great deal of experience in how these industries work at ground level for the average worker, they will still get to make plenty of decisions based on their qualification from that specific institution. But fair enough. We live in a world where anyone can go there and learn the skills needed to be able to do that. The issue is that plenty of students who go to Harvard have advantages that many applicants don't. There's a 33% acceptance rate for applicants who have a relative who went there, as opposed to a 6% acceptance rate for applicants who don't. There are even some wealthy families that start their children on a path to a Harvard application when they're newly born. This is just not an option for many poorer families. While there are definitely people from lower incomes who have studied there and there are options for scholarships and mentorships and whatever else, they're relatively few and far between. In many cases, those few from lower income households who manage to make it to these higher status institutions are the exception and not the rule. For both, I think the best way to eliminate this class stagnation that education like this brings about is to make it more accessible to the masses. I'm not sold on Harvard offering a vastly superior quality of education to anywhere else. I know that it's a great place to network, but networks with that amount of outsized influence, I don't think they should really exist, or at the very least, they should be better accessible to the wider public. The Imperium, conversely, really doesn't need to isolate its best students from the rest of society and create an elite social strata of emotionally closed off and stunted leaders. They can open access to this sort of knowledge to the wider population and could potentially increase the instances of an individual like Yarick occurring. At the heart of it, both the Imperium and our own world often squander talent by confusing pedigree with potential. If humanity wants to survive, on the Earth we know, or on Holy Terra, it needs to stop burying brilliance under bureaucracy and birthright. Alright, that was a really difficult thing to say. Now, moving on. In the Imperium of Man, information isn't free. It's filtered, sanctified, and weaponized. You don't learn facts in the Imperium, you take in doctrine. Now, we don't burn heretics for reading engineering manuals or arrest people for telling doctors to wash their hands anymore, but elite universities and paywall journals still ensure that only certain people get the keys to understanding, at least on certain topics. Knowledge is power, after all, and the Imperium guards it well. I've already got another video on the Imperium and how it deals with knowledge, especially when it comes to the threats it faces. You can find that link below. Most of the knowledge that Imperial citizens have about the wider galaxy, often even just the world that they live on, will come from Imperial propaganda. It is ubiquitous in their society, from the symbols and imagery that they use to the very language they speak. The Imperium saturates daily life with its symbols, like the two-headed Imperial Aquila. Even language is shaped by it, with throne and terra being everyday expressions of fear, awe, and loyalty. These words mean that even their thoughts, the Emperor, and the very heart of Imperial government is never far away. The way they see the universe, their whole understanding of reality, is framed with the Imperial government in mind. This is actually something that the Imperium does very well, at least when you consider the state of its society. People living on a multitude of worlds, each with different languages, cultures, customs, and traditions, will all have the wider Imperial symbols in common. There are real-world versions of this that can be seen all over. A national flag is usually a pretty evocative symbol for people, and it can be far more complicated than you might think. Beyond even displays at international sporting events, displaying flags can be seen as a provocative act in and of itself. Even here in Ireland, you can see how symbols still fuel division. In July, some parts of the north will be draped in Union Jacks, sometimes directly next to bonfires built to burn the Irish tricolour. These aren't just celebrations of old victories, they are power statements, cultural dominance through ritual fire. But these actions have far more meaning for the people who take part in them, and the people who are forced to watch the symbols of their own community burn in huge fires. In the Horus Heresy series of novels, there are plenty of instances of iterators, the Great Crusade fleet's propaganda artists, going about their way to erase whatever non-imperial cultures were on newly conquered worlds, and they also replaced them. This is something that the Imperium has managed to improve upon for millennia. It is genuinely excellent at creating and propagating effective propaganda. The agents of the Golden Throne are able to quell rebellions and enforce painfully strict rules by the careful spread and restriction of information. While this means that the quality of life for the average citizen is not great, the Imperium itself can better endure many immediate crises. But, in spite of how well they manage to get people to understand certain, relatively simple topics, the Imperium obviously struggles to do more. The government on Terra is usually only able to react to situations and is rarely able to be proactive against threats. The truth is, the Imperium doesn't just fail to educate its people, it fears what they might do with a real understanding. A citizen who can think critically is a threat to the system built on obedience, fear, and selective memory. Some argue that suppressing knowledge is necessary to protect the masses from chaos, but in practice, the Imperium rarely shows that this censorship actually works. Citizens still suffer, just blindly. Like in the aftermath of the Great Rift, when knowledge of things like chaos and the Imperial weapons against it, like the Grey Knights, became more public, little changed. In fact, when representatives of the Imperial government restrict information, it seems to cause at least as many problems as it solves. The information that the Imperium leaves for its citizens often forces them into situations where they can only react to events. They are rarely ever able to be proactive against upcoming threats. Evocative as it is, imperial propaganda has its limits. It builds loyalty until it's tested, but it restricts the vocabulary of those subjected to it. And when they inevitably have to face things outside of their forcibly limited understanding, their world and that carefully constructed loyalty can break. Will the Imperium ever be able to change this and actually give more information to its people? I don't know. I don't think it would really be the Imperium if we're able to do that, to be honest with you. The imperial government seems designed to fear its own citizens being able to think clearly and for themselves more than any of the other myriad of other real threats that it faces. Now, coming back to more physical needs for the Imperium, we get to its infrastructure. Every society, no matter how advanced or decrepit, relies on infrastructure. When it comes to the Imperium, I want to focus on who the infrastructure they build benefits and the priorities they have when they do actually create infrastructure. I've used the example of the ecclesiarchal buildings on Terra before. The homeworld of humanity paved over to form an ecumenopolis, yet instead of creating any sort of sustainable food production or storage, the focus of building for generations was given to the spiritual needs of its citizens. During the opening of the Great Rift, when warp storms cut off supply routes, Terra descended into famine and chaos. A world of possibly trillions, paved over in monuments, had no food security. People starved beneath mile-high cathedrals. Even worse, these temples were built in part to stop the spread of chaotic influence. Yet some of these temples had actually been built around demon-possessed artifacts, and they helped amplify the Khornate invasion further. If you want to read more about this, I cannot recommend the book Watchers of the Throne by Chris Wraight highly enough. I want to speak more about the Irish references in the real world for this. Really, it's my own bias, and I just know the subject matter a little better than elsewhere. Irish rail has long suffered from a bad reputation, in part because its infrastructure just wasn't built for the locals. If you look at a map of the rail lines in Ireland about 100 years ago, we used to have way more. Much of the lines that the government has been trying to put back in the last few years were all taken up in the middle of the 20th century. There's a few reasons for this. Railways were seen as antiquated in much of the English-speaking world at the time. Cars were the future, and so roads were prioritised. There's also the fact that Ireland doesn't really have any coal. The peat-fired trains were much slower. The Cork to Dublin route took something like 3 hours by coal-fired train. Then, when we got into a trade war with the British and couldn't import any of that, the journey went up to something like 18 hours. All of these things combined to give rail travel a bad reputation in Ireland. But even if nothing like this ever happened, I'd say much of the rail lines would have had to be torn up regardless. They weren't really built for the people living here. Many of them were built to move goods and soldiers around the country. Even in remote places like Connemara in the west, most of the lines were actually built to bring wealthy tourists from the likes of London. When air travel became available, these travellers were able to go somewhere that actually had something called sunshine. The infrastructure that was built in Ireland was never built to last. It was built for specific purposes that didn't have much to do with the quality of life for the people who lived near it. In the Imperium, this sort of thing happens all the time. If the Imperium does go out of its way to help the local government in creating any infrastructure, they will usually only do it in order to move resources somewhere else via the imperial tithe. Even in the very heart of the Imperium, old Earth itself, this creates problems. Infrastructure is too often a symbol of control, not care. When communities see that roads, rails, and shrines only exist to extract or dominate, they don't feel gratitude. They feel resentment. And sometimes, rebellion. Back to Ireland. By the 1960s, physical infrastructure was visibly declining, especially in rural areas. As emigration rose, job opportunities dried up for those who remained. The state simply wasn't investing in keeping communities connected. Donegal in the Republic, and the most northerly part of the island of Ireland, was cut off from the capital of Dublin when the railway through Derry, or Londonderry depending on who you ask, was removed, leaving Donegal increasingly isolated. This was around the same time that many of the factories that had made Belfast the envy of the whole island started to close up shop and move elsewhere in the world. This collapse in what was apparently unsustainable infrastructure had devastating consequences. All of this led to tensions between two communities that, at least from the outside, were far more similar than different. There is, of course, hundreds of years of history that led to the conflict in the northern part of Ireland from 1968 to 1998. I am not going to go into all of it here. Nationalists, who usually, but not always, identified as both Irish and Catholic, fought Unionists, who usually, but not always, identified as British and Protestant. This conflict between two groups led to a low-intensity civil war in the United Kingdom for 30 years in the latter part of the 20th century. It also led to the longest deployment in British military history. Operation Banner lasted from 1969 to 2007, and around 300,000 British soldiers took part. There's an excellent documentary called Squaddies in the Front Line. It was created by the BBC, and there should be some versions up of it on YouTube. It tells the story of at least some of these soldiers from their own point of view. Many of them came from other parts of the United Kingdom with little knowledge of Ireland or why there were tensions between these two groups. There were plenty in the establishment and the media that reinforced the idea that they were only fighting over religion and not genuine political grievance. When their stint in the army was over, many of these soldiers became disillusioned with their government and felt that they had been at the very least taken advantage of. It wasn't uncommon for many of the veterans of Operation Banner to fall into cycles of poor mental health, homelessness, and drug abuse. This is the Imperium to a T. The Munitorium will send people to environments throughout the galaxy that they have no real knowledge or understanding of. Regiments of the Imperial Guard will be expected to uphold the Emperor's domain, regardless of the local climate or any social structures. There are plenty of stories in the lore of the Imperial leadership proclaiming that a certain war zone is something other than what it actually is. They will devote the resources they feel are needed to win their declared challenge, regardless of whether or not it will actually work. These practices not only lead to the misallocation of military resources, but they also lead to the Imperium losing armies on worlds for decades and forgetting about them. Some members of these forgotten regiments have decided to abandon their former masters that treated them so harshly and have turned coat to whatever enemy they may have been fighting against. What is the best way to avoid this type of military blunder? Usually, it's not getting involved in the first place. Sometimes diplomacy and tact can win people over far more effectively than vast armies and empires ever can. Acknowledging a political solution and addressing it can often be all that's needed to avoid bloodshed. Indeed, even just acknowledging the fact that you might not know everything about a certain situation and need to take the time in advance before making any sort of major commitment can be all that's needed to avoid a huge blunder. But in order to do so, you have to do something that people find incredibly difficult. You have to admit that you might be wrong. And with that, we come to the final piece of this overview of the Imperium: time. At the beginning of Operation Banner in 1969, the British military put up peace walls between two communities in Belfast. The intention was for them to be only a temporary solution to the civil strife. The peace walls are still there over half a century later. They've grown longer than the Berlin Wall ever was and have lasted years longer still. In 2003, when the United States government was planning its invasion of Iraq, the thinking among cabinet members like Donald Rumsfeld was that the war would dominate the first term of President George W. Bush. The war actually lasted a couple of decades and led to the deaths of, at least by some estimates, over 1 million Iraqis. Both conflicts were entered into without a clear vision of the nature of the task at hand in terms of opponents, resources, and time. The latter factor exacerbated every challenge that was faced. In the Imperium, we see plenty of conflicts that start without a clear vision of how long they'll last or without a clear endpoint. Prior to 2003, the United States had a doctrine of using overwhelming force to shock and awe their opponents. This was seen in the first Iraq War, when they had over 1 million troops massed to repel the Iraqi invasion of Kuwait. This wasn't the case in 2003, when a force was used that, while capable of defeating the official army, it wasn't able to deal with the subsequent insurgency threat posed after the defeat of Saddam Hussein. The Imperium does this sort of thing again and again. There are countless war zones where the bare minimum of resources are allocated. These forces are seen as enough by the imperial savants and bookkeepers of the Munitorium. But in reality, the Imperium struggles to deal with the threats in the same way that nations have in the real world. During the Damocles Gulf Crusade against the Tau Empire, the Imperium brought a huge force to bear against the upstart Xenos Empire. Even though they were going up against the Tau, a faction in the setting that many believe isn't a threat to the Imperium at all, this massive crusade force wasn't enough. Yes, they were able to push deep into Tau space and invade a major Sept world, but the conflict went on for longer and went further away from the Astronomicon than any Imperial strategists thought it would. Once word came from Inquisitor Cryptman about the initial Tyranid invasion of Macragge, the war was functionally over and a stalemate had been reached. Even the Emperor's Great Crusade wasn't immune to mistakes when it came to planning and time management. Yes, the Emperor amassed one of, if not the greatest fighting force the galaxy has ever seen, but he rushed the job. Many of the other perpetuals that the Emperor knew with and worked with previously seemed to have abandoned him when they came to learn of his plans for the galaxy. Some of them were disgusted by the scale of it. While he did manage to conquer 1 million worlds in only a couple of centuries, he lost it at the endgame. By rushing back to Terra to try to complete the Imperial Webway project, he left himself and his new empire open to betrayal. As the audience, we really can't get any good idea about what the Emperor's reasoning was for leaving the Great Crusade when he did, but we can see some of the negative things that it led to. The protection against the warp was lost when Magnus tried to warn the Emperor about Horus's betrayal. This led to Magnus's persecution. The wars in the Imperial Palace, which kept the Emperor out of the entirety of the conflict until the very end, and it's part of the reason why he's still kept on the Golden Throne 10,000 years later. But how can you improve this time expenditure? I think you just really have to commit. The US forces were able to defeat Saddam in the First Gulf War by using overwhelming force, yet they were afraid of what it would look like to voters in 2003. When the Emperor left the Great Crusade, he left it unfinished. There were plenty of reasons for him to leave it when he did. The Astronomicon being too difficult to maintain that far from Terra being a big one. Regardless of why he left or when, it was how he left that military campaign without a leader that was fully aware of his overall vision that was the issue. Horus should have been given the knowledge of exactly what the Emperor was doing, rather than being expected to rely entirely on his faith. The Imperium, like many other empires before it, doesn't just fail because it's brutal. It fails because it's rushed, reactive, and afraid to commit to the realities of its own ambition. But then again, this is Warhammer 40k. There has to be some reason as to why all of the grim darkness happens, and the Emperor making some mistakes along the way is a great way to make it happen. Let's conclude. The Imperium of Man, it survives, but its people don't thrive. They barely even live. The Empire of a Million Worlds limps forward, powered by fear, sacrifice, and the sheer inertia of a broken system too vast to fix and too cruel to stop. It's easy to point at the aliens, the mutants, the heretics, but the real threat might just be the Imperium itself. If you found this breakdown interesting, I've already made a video about the external threats facing the Imperium, the ones that we know about and the ones that they choose to ignore. The link to that and the previous video in this series should be somewhere around this one now. If you want more lore with real-world tint, please make sure to like and subscribe. It all really does help to build this channel. There's more to come. I want to keep these videos going. I want to build this channel out and see where it goes. I'll see you in the next one. Slán.